Another question.
Yes, this is one for Tony. Having been in the Ukraine recently, is there any merit at all in the Chinese proposal to or offer to mediate? Now, the 12 points, if you look at them, they're online, do seem balanced and reasonable. It's very broad. They're very broad, and I realise the devil's in the detail. But given the carnage there, the terrible desperation and the awful scenario you outline, should we at least consider it? Should our leaders at least give it some consideration?
The Chinese proposal. Fintan, you might have an opinion on this as well.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sorry, I just don't trust the Chinese. That's, the devil's in the Politburo. So that's where my problem with that comes in. The Chinese are basically interested in doing the same thing, but in Taiwan. And what they mostly don't want to do is to have a precedent where the world gets up and stops that kind of territorial grab from happening. So I guess I have this underlying distrust of their motives. I saw the things, yes, on the surface, some of those points do look reasonable, but I think the Chinese have already kind of put themselves on Putin's side to some degree. What we must hope and is that the world really puts pressure on the Chinese not to arm or rearm Russia. That to me is the most terrifying prospect, that this becomes a kind of de facto world war, where China is propping up another dictatorship and, the rest of the world is trying to fight against it. We're all arming the other side. I mean, this has potential for global conflict.
Fintan, do you have a...
I would pretty much share that. I mean, I think the question is absolutely right that of course, every avenue has to be explored, right? You can't just sit back and say, let this go on and on and on. If there's any possibility of a settlement, even if it is a Korean settlement, it has to be addressed. The real problem, though, is China a credible, honest broker? And sadly, it's not. There's no mention in its 12 points of human rights. There's no mention of any kind of recognition of the wrong that has been done. And you cannot reconcile. You can't have any kind of peace process that doesn't start out by saying, actually, these are not equivalents. Being invaded is not the same thing as invading. Committing war crimes is not the same thing as being the victims of those war crimes. It's an enormous dilemma at the moment, right? Which is, what is the end game? The Powell Doctrine in the United States, which came in really after Vietnam, right? Which is, what questions should you ask before you engage in a conflict? And let's face it, the West is now engaged in a conflict. I don't think it had a choice. It could not allow Ukraine to be defeated. But the more we put men and material into this, the more you're left with the fact that the West is a belligerent. And if it's becoming a belligerent, it has to ask, well, the two most important questions in the Powell Doctrine is a series of them, but one is what constitutes victory? What is the attainable goal? Now, I think most of us would agree on what the desirable goal is, which is that Putin falls, is put on trial, is that there's a withdrawal of the Russians to the internationally recognized borders, including evacuating Crimea. I just don't think any of those things are going to happen. There isn't a realistic sense of where that end game might become possible, and therefore you have to ask, what is the attainable goal? What's a decent possible settlement? And this goes back to what you were saying, really, very much. And the other thing as well, it was related to that, which is, what's an exit strategy? How do you get out of this? Because it's not in the interests of Europe, and it's not in the interests of Ukraine for this war, as Tony was saying, just to go on and on and on, which at the moment, that's what it looks like.
But it's not in Russia's interest either, is it? It's Chechnya, it's Afghanistan, they've got cultural memory. They have to have an exit strategy too, surely. Chris, would you like the final word on this?
Yeah, I think, just coming back to the Chinese thing, I think it was a complete fake by the Chinese. They were speaking through both sides of their face on that. We've got to understand that every day this Ukraine war goes on, it's more likely and there not to be an extremely long conflict, very, 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 very long conflict, unless everyone steps up and out of the situation and works out, okay, how can we contain and cauterize this for a period if we can't solve it? And I just think that's the only way out. Unfortunately, the collapse of America pretty much as a moral force in international affairs is because of Trump, has really interfered with that possibility, normally that they kind of play that role. Britain's a smoking ruin. Maybe a Macron could do it. He's, as an individual he could, but France as a country can't do it. Germany is still working through its own issues, very visibly, day to day, fascinatingly, in relation to the Ukraine war, in terms of its own adjustments internally, politically. I mean, what a moment. What a moment. This is, in the structure versus agency arguments in history, this is the moment for an influential agent to step on the stage and transform the debate and lead a mediation that can lead to containment and cauterization for the interim until something sustainable can be worked out.
Like Henry Kissinger?
Maybe not.
Folks, Adelaide Writers' Week commences shortly over the road, and I'm sure many of you are anxious to get there. Breakfast with Papers continues all through the festival for the next 2 weeks. Tomorrow morning, John Fain, Dean Ashenden and Mike Lorrigan. Could you join me in thanking Tony Jones, Chris Wallace and Fintan O'Toole? Thank you.